The cameras were already rolling, the lights burning hot against the polished wood of the hearing room. It was supposed to be another routine session, another exchange of words that would fade into the endless noise of political theater. But then Elon Musk leaned forward. His voice, sharp and impatient, cut across Jasmine Crockett's sentence like a blade. For the first time that day, the air shifted. This wasn't going to be ordinary. 5 times he had already interrupted her. 5 times the world's richest man tried to press his weight against her words, hoping money and arrogance could bend truth into silence. And yet, every time he cut her off, Crockett didn't flinch. Her eyes narrowed, her tone steadied, and with each attempted shutdown, the room began to sense something gathering, an energy not of anger, but of patience, discipline, and unshakable resolve. The audience inside the chamber shifted uneasily, glancing at one another, wondering how long she could hold back. Phones went up, fingers tapping frantically, trying to capture this tension before it boiled over. Outside the chamber, millions would soon watch, waiting to see if a single voice could withstand the pressure of a billionaire who thought interruptions could erase inconvenient truths. But Crockett wasn't just anyone. She carried with her the weight of every underdog who had been told to sit down, the strength of every immigrant family who had been talked over, the dignity of every woman who had been dismissed by men who thought louder meant stronger. And in that silence between Musk's last interruption and her reply, the atmosphere thickened, as though history itself was leaning in. Then she looked up, calm, steady, unbroken. The world would remember what came next not as an argument, not as a clash of egos, but as a moment when dignity chose its time to strike. And as Elon Musk shifted in his chair, preparing to interrupt for the 6th time, he didn't realize he had already lost. Because when Jasmine Crockett finally spoke, her words would not just silence the man across from her. They would echo far beyond those walls, leaving millions to ask themselves the same question. How many times can truth be interrupted before it finally demands to be heard? What happened next would leave the entire room in stunned silence. The silence that followed was more powerful than any outburst. For a moment, even the cameras seemed to lean in, hungry for what Jasmine Crockett would unleash. But before her 6th point could land, we need to understand why this moment mattered so much. Why a billionaire's interruptions weren't just rude, but symbolic of something deeper tearing at the fabric of America. Elon Musk wasn't just another voice at the table. He was the embodiment of wealth, arrogance, and the belief that money could purchase respect. To many, he had become a symbol of unchecked privilege, a man who could buy companies, shape markets, and even tilt the conversation of democracy itself. His decision to interrupt Crockett wasn't only about words. It was about reinforcing a dangerous message, that voices like hers could be dismissed, talked over, erased. And then there was Jasmine Crockett. For her, this wasn't merely a clash of personalities. Every interruption she endured connected to something larger, the lived experience of millions who had been cut off, silenced, or told their voices didn't matter. She wasn't speaking just for herself. She was carrying the weight of those who had been denied the microphone for generations. The stakes of this exchange rippled far beyond the committee room. To Musk supporters, interruptions were power plays, a demonstration of dominance. But to those watching with weary eyes from the outside, it was a test. Could truth stand against arrogance? Could dignity outlast disruption? And most importantly, would America finally witness a moment where the interrupter was forced to listen? Inside the chamber, tension mounted with each breath. Staffers whispered nervously. Reporters scribbled furiously, already framing their headlines. Musk clashes with Crockett. But what the headlines would miss was the feeling, the rising electric current pulsing through the air as if the crowd sensed that something bigger was coming. Outside, social media was already alive. Clips of Musk's interruptions circulated within minutes. Hashtags forming, anger building. Each time he cut her off, comments poured in. This is unacceptable. Let her speak. We've seen this too many times. What none of those commenters knew yet was that Crockett wasn't finished. She wasn't breaking. She was waiting for the perfect strike. This wasn't just a battle of words. It was a reflection of a larger struggle. Who gets to speak, who gets to be heard, and who gets silenced in the America of today? The arrogance of money versus the dignity of truth. One man's interruptions against one woman's resolve. And everyone watching felt the pull of that gravity. Because deep down, audiences crave more than entertainment. They crave justice. They crave the moment when someone finally says what the world has been waiting to hear. And as Crockett took a breath, her eyes fixed forward, the world knew that moment was almost here. The stakes could not be higher. If Musk succeeded in silencing her, the headlines would read that arrogance had won again. But if Crockett found her voice and struck at just the right time, it would ripple far beyond this hearing, into conversations in living rooms, schools, and workplaces across the nation. And so the question lingered in every mind, burning hotter with every second. Would dignity finally have its day? The answer came in Musk's own downfall, revealed through his arrogance. Because before Crockett spoke, the world needed to see exactly
To
who
understand
she was standing
why
against. Elon Musk's interruptions carried such weight, we have to pull back the curtain and look at the man himself. Not just the headlines or the myth, but the contradictions that shaped him into the perfect villain for this moment. Musk's story has always been told as one of genius and grit, the immigrant entrepreneur who clawed his way from South Africa to Silicon Valley, building empires out of nothing but ambition. But beneath the glossy narrative lay something darker, a pattern of arrogance, an impatience with being challenged, a belief that rules were for others. He wasn't just wealthy, he was untouchable, or at least he thought he was. In the world of business, his sharp elbows had often been celebrated. Investors called it confidence, fans called it vision. But in the unforgiving arena of public debate, that same arrogance became something else entirely. Each time he interrupted Jasmine Crockett, he wasn't defending a point. He was clinging to control. It was the instinct of a man who had always believed his voice mattered more than anyone else's, and that silence was a gift he bestowed, not a right others deserved. The interruptions weren't accidental. They were part of a long-standing playbook. Musk had done it in boardrooms, on Twitter Spaces, and press conferences. Cut someone off, derail their thought, flood the space with noise. For years, it worked. People laughed nervously, deferred to his status, or simply gave up. But this time was different because Jasmine Crockett was not playing by the rules he was used to, and that unnerved him. Look closely at Musk's body language during those 5 interruptions. The way his eyes darted when Crockett didn't flinch, the tightening of his jaw when she calmly waited him out, the restless shifting in his chair. He wasn't in control anymore, and for a man like him, losing control was worse than losing the argument. His backstory only sharpened the contrast. Here was a man who had built rockets that touched the edge of space, cars that redefined transportation, companies that moved billions of dollars in markets overnight. And yet, for all the grand achievements, he was reduced to the simplest, oldest tactic in the book, talking over a woman, hoping volume could defeat substance. That was the irony. The man who dreamed of colonizing Mars couldn't even tolerate a full sentence spoken by someone who challenged him on Earth. For Musk, interruptions were more than a reflex, they were a shield. Behind the bravado was a fear he would never admit. The fear of being exposed, of facing someone whose calm truth could unravel his carefully crafted aura. His fortune couldn't protect him from that. His fame couldn't drown it out. And with each failed interruption, the mask began to slip. Audiences watching felt it. The more he tried to dominate, the smaller he looked. What once seemed like confidence now looked like insecurity. What once passed for brilliance now read as desperation. And as the world witnessed him stumble, something inside the chamber shifted. The balance of power began to tip, not because Crockett had shouted him down, but because she had refused to bend. But here's where the story sharpens. Musk's downfall wasn't going to come from his wealth or his ego alone. It was going to come from the very contrast between his bluster and Crockett's composure. The louder he grew, the more dignified she seemed. The more he reached for control, the more it slipped away. In trying to silence her, he amplified her voice. The antagonist's backstory always matters because it sets the stage for why their collapse feels so satisfying. And Musk had written his own script long before this day. Years of dismissing critics, belittling employees, attacking journalists. Those patterns all collided in this moment. He thought it would be just another interruption, but it became the setup for his public unraveling. Still, Crockett hadn't spoken her 6-point yet. The world hadn't heard the words that would silence him completely. But the stage was ready. His arrogance had laid the foundation. His interruptions had exposed the cracks. And all that was left was for Jasmine Crockett to step into the light, not just as the calm voice in the storm, but as the hero shaped by a story of her own, one that made her the perfect counterweight to everything Musk represented. Because before she struck, the audience needed to know not only the man she was facing, but the journey that had forged the woman who refused to be silenced. Before Jasmine Crockett spoke her 6-point, before she silenced Elon Musk in a way that would ripple across the country, we have to understand who she is and why her voice carried the kind of power that no amount of money or arrogance could erase. Jasmine Crockett did not arrive in that chamber with inherited billions or a cult of admirers who cheered her every move. She came armed with something rarer, the lived truth of struggle, sacrifice, and service. Her story was not written in the language of privilege, but in the grit of persistence. And that made her interruptions not just a political slight, but a personal echo of every door she'd ever had slammed in her face. Raised in a community where opportunity was often rationed out sparingly, Crockett learned early what it meant to fight for space to speak. Teachers doubted her. Mentors questioned her. Doors that swung open for others remained stubbornly shut in her path. But she never stopped pushing. Instead of bitterness, she built resilience. Instead of folding under pressure, she sharpened her resolve. Each setback became training for the larger battles ahead. When she chose the path of public service, it wasn't because it was easy or glamorous. It was because she understood the voices of her community were being lost in the noise. She fought for immigrants struggling to be heard in a country that often pretended they were invisible. She stood with working families who wondered if anyone in Washington actually cared about their lives. She carried into that chamber the hopes of every woman who had been interrupted, dismissed, or overlooked. That was her armor. An armor forged in real struggle is stronger than anything wealth can buy. Her composure that day was not accidental. It was the product of years of practice, standing her ground in courtrooms, in town halls, in neighborhoods where skepticism outnumbered support. She had been told 1,000 times to lower her voice, to wait her turn, to let others speak first. But Crockett understood something Musk never would. Silence can be a weapon when used wisely. Holding steady, waiting for the right moment, can make the blow land harder than any shouting match. It is precisely this backstory that framed her as the perfect counterweight to Musk. He represented entitlement. She represented earned dignity. He embodied impatience. She embodied discipline. He had been handed the microphone of the world. She had fought for every second of hers. And on that day, in that room, the contrast was electric. As Musk cut her off 5 times, the audience inside and outside the chamber began to see it. They weren't just watching a debate. They were watching a reenactment of America's oldest story. The powerful trying to drown out the powerless, and the powerless refusing to disappear. Crockett became more than a congresswoman. She became a stand-in for every underdog who had ever been told their voice didn't matter. Her calm wasn't weakness. It was strategy. She was letting him write the script of his own downfall, line by line, interruption by interruption. The crowd could feel it, even if Musk could not. Each attempt to shut her down made the anticipation sharper. What would she say when she finally chose to strike? And beyond the chamber, beyond the headlines, millions watching felt an intimacy with her struggle. Immigrant families saw in her their own children trying to speak English over the noise of mockery. Women saw in her their own experiences of being dismissed at work, in classrooms, in conversations where their expertise was ignored. Working people saw in her their own fights to have their stories taken seriously by those who live in boardrooms instead of neighborhoods. Crockett's backstory mattered because it made her victory personal for everyone who had ever been interrupted. And it made Musk's arrogance not just offensive, but unbearable. This is why the chamber felt electric in those tense seconds after his fifth interruption. The audience wasn't only waiting for her words. They were waiting for justice, for vindication, for the moment when patience would transform into power. Because the truth is, her sixth point wasn't just going to silence Musk. It was going to validate millions of voices at once. It would remind America that dignity isn't a gift handed down by billionaires. It is a right carried by everyone who refuses to be silenced. And as she finally inhaled, ready to unleash the words that would turn this confrontation into history, the world leaned forward. But before she struck, the room had to witness the storm Musk himself created. The escalating clash that made her response not only necessary, but inevitable. The storm had been building from the very first interruption. By the time Elon Musk cut Jasmine Crockett off for the fifth time, the air in the chamber felt charged, as if even the walls themselves understood something explosive was about to unfold. It wasn't just two people trading words anymore. It was a test of endurance, a battle of wills. And the tension was unbearable. Each interruption followed the same pattern. Musk leaned forward, his voice dripping with impatience, slicing across Crockett's sentences as though her words were obstacles in his way. His tone was dismissive, a performance of superiority. But every time, Crockett absorbed it with a calm stare, her lips pressed into the faintest of smiles, refusing to give him the satisfaction of anger. The more he pushed, the more the audience could see it. She wasn't breaking. She was waiting. By the fourth interruption, staffers at the back of the room exchanged nervous glances. They had seen men like Musk before, loud, unrelenting, convinced that power meant never having to listen. But what they hadn't seen often was someone who could meet that arrogance with such unshakable poise. The fifth interruption was the most dramatic yet. Crockett began a sentence about accountability, her words steady, when Musk lunged into her space verbally, his voice booming, trying to suffocate her point before it could breathe. The room gasped. Someone in the gallery muttered under their breath. A reporter scribbled faster, knowing this was no longer just a hearing. It was history. But here was the twist. The more Musk interrupted, the smaller he seemed. What he thought projected dominance instead revealed desperation. His interruptions no longer read as strength, but as fear. Fear of what Crockett was about to say. Fear of what her truth might expose. Crockett, meanwhile, grew taller with every attempt to silence her. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't flail or fume. She simply waited, letting the weight of his arrogance build around him like a trap he couldn't escape. Her restraint became its own form of defiance, and the chamber began to sense it. She wasn't cornered. She was in control. Phones buzzed silently as clips of the escalating clash began to spread online. Hashtags emerged in real time. Hashtag let her speak. Hashtag Crockett versus Musk. The outside world was already taking sides, and Musk didn't even realize he was losing the narrative before the fight had truly begun. By the time his fifth interruption faded into the thick air of the chamber, the audience knew something Musk did not. He had set the stage for his own undoing. Each attempted shutdown had stacked anticipation higher and higher, until the silence between interruptions felt deafening. Crockett looked up, her composure unbroken, her voice steady as she began again. She had waited long enough, and this time she wouldn't be cut off, because what she was about to deliver, the sixth point, wouldn't just pierce through his arrogance. It would turn the entire room on its head. The escalation had reached its breaking point, and when the silence shattered, it would be Musk who couldn't find the words to answer. For 5 long interruptions, Elon Musk had treated Jasmine Crockett like background noise, something to be managed, controlled, brushed aside. Each time, he came with the same blend of impatience and smug certainty, the tone of a man who had grown used to his voice being the loudest in every room. But now, as he leaned forward for his sixth attempt, ready to slice into her words yet again, something shifted. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't roll her eyes, didn't lash out, didn't even let frustration flicker across her face. Instead, she did the one thing Musk wasn't prepared for. She paused. She let the silence hang for a moment, forcing the entire room to lean in. And then, in a voice measured, precise, and unshakably calm, she began. "Mr. Musk," she said, her tone slicing through the tension with surgical precision, "the interruptions won't change the facts. They won't change the truth. And they won't change what you don't want to hear." The air in the chamber grew heavier. Phones tilted higher. Musk straightened, suddenly aware that the script was slipping from his hands. Crockett wasn't fighting his interruptions anymore. She was about to bury them. She laid out her sixth point not as a single statement, but as a cascade of truths, each building on the last. She recited figures, testimonies, undeniable records, each word placed with the certainty of someone who had lived these struggles, not just observed them from the glass walls of a corporate tower. And with each fact, she did what no interruption could erase. She painted a picture of reality too vivid to ignore. "Every time you've tried to silence me," she continued, "you've proven the very point I'm making, that power thinks it can drown out justice. But justice doesn't stutter. It doesn't pause for permission. And it doesn't stop speaking just because someone wealthier tries to talk over it." Gasps rippled through the room. Even the stenographer hesitated, glancing up to capture the electricity in the moment. Social media would soon explode with clips, hashtags already forming in the minds of those typing furiously at the back. But inside the chamber, it was Musk's reaction that told the story. His smirk faltered. His interruptions died before they could form. For the first time all day, Elon Musk had no words. Crockett pressed on, her voice rising not in anger, but in conviction. "You asked me to explain, and when I did, you cut me off. You told me to provide evidence, and when I brought it, you dismissed it. But here's the reality. The truth doesn't wait for your approval. It stands whether you acknowledge it or not." By now, the silence in the room wasn't just Musk's. It belonged to everyone. Senators leaned back in their chairs, the audience held their breath, and the viewers at home felt the same chill, the realization that they weren't watching a debate. They were witnessing a takedown. And Crockett wasn't done. She leaned forward, not aggressively, but deliberately, as though to reclaim the space Musk had tried to dominate. "You've interrupted me 5 times, sir, but it only takes one truth to outlast 1,000 interruptions." That was the moment. The mic drop. The pivot from defense to undeniable authority. In just a few sentences, she reframed the entire exchange. Not as a billionaire silencing a congresswoman, but as a congresswoman exposing the limits of billionaire power. The cameras zoomed closer, catching Musk's tightening jaw, his restless shifting. A man who had entered with confidence now sat cornered by words he couldn't dismiss. For the first time, his silence was louder than his interruptions. And Jasmine Crockett, she didn't gloat. She didn't smirk or celebrate. She simply let the weight of her words settle in the air, then leaned back, her composure intact, her dignity untouchable. The chamber erupted, not with cheers, but with a stunned, reverent quiet. Everyone knew they had just witnessed the turning point, the moment when the underdog became the undeniable voice in the room. What came next would not only shake the hearing, it would ripple across the country. Because when clips of that sixth point hit the internet, silence itself would become the headline. But as the applause of the digital world began to rise, the aftermath would prove that this silence was only the beginning. The silence didn't stay trapped within the 4 walls of that hearing room. It spread, first as a whisper, then as a roar. The moment Jasmine Crockett's sixth point landed, the ripple began. By the time the session adjourned, clips of her words were already flooding onto Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. Within minutes, hashtags like hashtag Crockett silences Musk and hashtag Truth Over Power were trending. People replayed the clip not once, not twice, but over and over again, savoring the precision of her words, the poise with which she delivered them, and the visible shift in Elon Musk's expression. Comment sections lit up. Finally, someone stood their ground. This is what leadership looks like. She didn't just speak for herself. She spoke for all of us who've ever been interrupted and ignored. Mainstream media moved quickly. Headlines framed it as a modern-day David versus Goliath moment. Congresswoman Crockett silences billionaire Musk splashed across digital front pages. Anchors play the clip in slow motion, breaking down the exact moment Musk's smirk fell and the room stilled. Late-night hosts tease the exchange in their opening monologues, playing up the arrogance of repeated interruptions and the poetic justice of the mic drop counterattack. But the shockwaves weren't just about entertainment. They carried weight. Activists shared the clip as proof that dignity and truth can still puncture the armor of wealth and power. High school debate teams dissected it as a case study in composure under pressure. Even seasoned politicians, many of whom had once dismissed Crockett as too bold, too blunt, now circulated the clip with thinly veiled admiration. Meanwhile, Musk's defenders scrambled to spin the narrative. A few sympathetic outlets suggested he was simply passionate or misunderstood, but no amount of rebranding could erase the footage. The interruptions were undeniable. The silence at the end was undeniable. The contrast between arrogance and dignity was undeniable. And in that undeniable truth, Crockett became more than a congresswoman. She became a symbol for every immigrant child told to quiet down, for every woman talked over in meetings, for every underdog who had been underestimated by those in power. She hadn't just spoken, she had represented. The effect reached beyond politics. Memes popped up within hours, pairing Musk's silenced expression with captions like, "When you run out of interruptions," and "net worth, billions." Arguments, zero. On TikTok, remix after remix layered her words over music, turning the clip into a rallying cry. And as the wave grew, so did the sense of collective ownership. People didn't just watch Crockett's takedown, they felt part of it. They shared it with friends, framed it as validation of their own struggles, as proof that arrogance can falter when confronted with steady truth. Inside her office, Crockett's team watched the numbers climb. Views hitting the millions, followers doubling, messages pouring in from strangers calling her the voice we needed. And while she didn't bask in the spectacle, she understood its significance. This wasn't just about Elon Musk. It was about showing that interruption doesn't erase truth, that dignity can still command a room. Yet even as admiration swelled, so did the tension. Because the same silence that elevated Crockett also raised the stakes. If one takedown could spark this kind of shockwave, what would come next? How far would her words travel? And how would those threatened by her growing influence respond? The country had already picked its sides. For some, she was a hero. For others, a threat. But for everyone, one fact was undeniable. Elon Musk's silence had awakened a storm. And the question now wasn't whether Jasmine Crockett had silenced him. It was what that silence was about to unleash across America. When the room finally settled, it wasn't just Musk who had been silenced. It was the arrogance, the interruptions, the assumption that power could overshadow truth. Jasmine Crockett didn't just win a debate. She reminded the world that dignity and perseverance always outlast noise and hubris. Her sixth point wasn't a victory for one woman alone. It was a triumph for every voice that had ever been dismissed, every person who had been told to wait their turn, every immigrant, every underrepresented community that had been underestimated. She had proven that preparation, patience, and unwavering conviction can turn moments of oppression into moments of inspiration. The moral was clear. Silence is not weakness. Restraint is not surrender. And courage isn't loud. It's consistent. True influence doesn't come from wealth or status. It comes from integrity, knowledge, and a refusal to bow to intimidation. Across social media, classrooms, and workplaces, Crockett's moment became more than a clip. It became a lesson in power and purpose. People weren't just applauding her words. They were seeing themselves reflected in her calm defiance. The story inspired those who had ever felt marginalized to speak up, to stand firm, and to recognize that their voices matter. In the end, the lesson of that hearing transcended politics. It was a reminder that truth, patience, and dignity have a force of their own. And when they are wielded with courage, even the most formidable interruptions cannot hold them back. Jasmine Crockett had not only silenced Elon Musk, She had amplified the voice of a nation waiting to be heard. As the cameras powered down and the room emptied, the impact of Jasmine Crockett's 6 point lingered long after the hearing ended. Elon Musk's interruptions, meant to dominate in silence, had instead highlighted the power of patience, preparation, and unwavering truth. Crockett's composure had turned a confrontation into a historic moment, a lesson for every person who had ever been underestimated or dismissed. For the audience at home, the takeaway was undeniable. Courage and dignity can outshine wealth and arrogance. Every viewer who had felt silenced or overlooked could see themselves in her, reminded that standing firm and speaking with integrity carries its own authority. The story wasn't just about a debate in a hearing room. It was about the potential each of us has to confront challenges, to resist intimidation, and to demand that our voices be heard. Now it's your turn. Share this moment with someone who needs to be reminded that resilience and truth matter. Subscribe to the channel to witness more stories of courage against overwhelming odds. Comment your thoughts. Let your voice be heard, and be part of the conversation that amplifies justice, dignity, and empowerment. Every like, every share, every subscription is more than digital engagement. It's validation that these stories matter, that voices like Jasmine Crockett's can inspire millions, and that your participation in this movement of awareness strengthens the power of truth. Remember, interruptions may come, distractions may rise, but integrity and courage are unstoppable. Let this be a call not just to watch history, but to make your own. Stand firm, speak clearly, and let the world know that no voice, no matter how small it may seem, can be silenced when it carries truth. Because real power doesn't shout, it resonates.